I was so pleased when Kirsty Carpenter asked me to introduce Dan Smail. I only wish we could all be together in Auckland to hear him. I remember hearing about Dan's path-breaking work on Marseille when he was still a doctoral student, and I read his wonderful first book, Imaginary Cartographies, when it came out in 1999. Then, just 4 years after that, his second groundbreaking book appeared, The Consumption of Justice, which also dealt with late medieval Marseille. Then, a few years later, I learned there was a new Dan Smail in the bookshops, and so I rushed out to get my copy of Deep History and the Brain, which is a very different sort of book, and to me it was an absolute eye-opener. An initiation into early global history and specifically into what Dan calls neurohistory. And it's also a book that I've since then recommended to any number of colleagues and students. For his fourth book, Dan returned to medieval history, although in a certain sense, it was continuing with a holistic historical agenda, an interest in the characteristics of human psychology runs through all of his work. But this was a specific comparison of the material culture of Marseille and Lucca in Legal Plunder, Households and Debt Collection in Late Medieval Europe, which came out in 2016. And that's an area that Dan's continuing to develop with an online project on the documentary archaeology of late medieval Europe, one that's primarily based on household inventories. And the website for that, I believe, is about to be fully rolled out, and there'll no doubt be an announcement on HFrance in due course. Dan is Frank B. Baird Jr., Professor of History at Harvard University, and today he's drawing on research for yet another project, this one on slavery in the medieval Mediterranean. And the specific aspect he's speaking to us about is the borderlands of slavery in medieval Mediterranean France. So over to you, Dan.
So first of all, thanks so much to David for that really kind introduction, and to everyone involved in the planning for the conference in Auckland, Tracy Adams, Kirsty Carpenter. All of you have been absolutely phenomenal. And I'm sure I speak for everyone in expressing my profound gratitude for all the work you've been doing here behind the scenes. It's such a disappointment that we all can't be there with you, but having a chance to meet virtually in this way is the next best thing. David Smith and HFrance, you guys have been equally phenomenal. So huge thumbs up to everyone. And I'm sure if you could see this now, you'd see a forest of thumbs going up. Now, with everything that's going on in the world, I have to say that the kind of work that I do feels a little inconsequential, and I'm really curious to find out whether other people are feeling the same thing. So it's just a special privilege to have a chance to talk about this work. And thanks to all of you out there for joining in. This paper, in fact, was inspired many years ago by my dear friend, Tip Reagan. Tip, I don't know if you remember this, but we were chatting about this and that one day, and you said to me something like this, you know, Dan, I know there was slavery in Europe during the Middle Ages, but by my period, it had vanished in France. So what happened? And I literally had no idea how to answer that question, because at the time I knew almost nothing about medieval slavery. It just wasn't one of those things that we learned in graduate school. So it's only in the last year or so that I picked up the invitation and have begun to actually work on slavery. I'm currently writing a book on slavery in Provence in the 14th and 15th centuries. And I'll be presenting some of those findings in the final section of this paper. Given the audience, however, what I wanted to do for this paper was to see how this work might fit into the broader currents of the French historiography of slavery. So I've been spending the last couple of months working through the really interesting literature that's been emerging for the Ancien Regime in the modern period, just to learn about the subject. And as the Colbert controversy has shown, the subject has been hotting up lately. So I'll begin with an overview of the literature, followed by two cases. And the basic idea of these cases is to show that our understanding of slavery in France will be enriched if we bring late medieval Mediterranean slavery into the picture. Now, here's a final thought on that point. Mediterranean slavery was racialized, but not in the form it took later. Most of the enslaved peoples were not from sub-Saharan Africa. That being the case, let me affirm that Black lives matter. At present, there's no consensus about how to connect Mediterranean slavery to the systematic enslavement of Africans and to the histories of colonialism and racism that came afterward. And this is a conversation that we really need to have. When the history of slavery in France started coming together as a narrative, it told the story of an institution that had flourished in antiquity and decayed ever since. The historians who wrote about slavery differed on the question of how to explain the trend, but all agreed that the ancient system of slavery had withered away by the 14th century. After the supposed emancipation of 1315, there were, supposedly, no more slaves to be found in France. And as you can see from this chart that I put together from the Histoire de la vie privée, it's hard to find anything if you don't believe it exists. And when I originally put this together, I just wanted a way to kind of sample in some longitudinal way a sense of how the scholarship in France has thought about slavery. And what I was really looking for, as I'm sure you can imagine, is, well, how much were they talking about slavery in the Middle Ages, the second column there. The really striking thing, of course, is volume 3, where despite the fact of what's going on in the Ancien Regime, there's very, very little discussion of slavery. By the early 17th century, as Sue Peabody has discussed, the related free soil principle, and this is the idea that a slave who had crossed the border into France and had received baptism was thereby free, was widely known throughout the country. The national myth suggested that freedom is deeply rooted in French civilization. In recent years, a good deal of work by historians has demonstrated the fallacy of this belief. French ideas about slavery in the Ancien Regime were profoundly inconsistent. But we should expect to find dissonance of this kind. Orlando Patterson has argued that freedom and slavery are two halves of the same coin, and each is incomplete without the other. In Patterson's model, slavery, the presence of slavery, the practice of slavery as an institution, generates talk of freedom. The insight makes it possible to bring abolitionist ideas and slave practices together into the same hermeneutical framework. Talk of freedom emerged in the early modern era because France had become entangled in the practice of slavery. In the meantime, however, the enduring belief that there were no slaves in France generated historiographical blind spots. And as we've been learning lately, these blind spots really powerfully affected scholarship on the Ancien Regime. But they also extended back in time and shaped slavery as a topic in my field, in medieval history. In the first issue of the journal Annales in 1929, Marc Bloch published a review of a study of slavery in later medieval Sicily. And this, in fact, was one of several small papers that he wrote about Mediterranean slavery. It was a subject that really fascinated him. In it, he declared categorically, Mediterranean France, like Sicily, had slaves. Why were historians of the region so reluctant to study the phenomenon? Le sujet, he argued, a passé inaperçu. Now, in point of fact, this was not entirely true. In the decades before and after the formal abolition of slavery in France in 1848, a history of slavery in Mediterranean France was beginning to emerge as local historians were delving into the notarial registers that were just entering the French archival system at that point. There they found disconcertingly vibrant evidence for the practice of chattel slavery in a zone stretching from Roussillon to Provence. And this came in the form of contracts of sale and manumission, really vivid evidence for chattel slavery. Some of the earliest references pop up in an 1854 history of Narbonne. 4 years later, in 1858, the jurist Anselme Montreuil published one of the earliest studies dedicated exclusively to Mediterranean slavery. In the introduction, he laid out that standard narrative I mentioned earlier, according to which slavery faded after the fall of Rome, gradually dissolving into serfdom before ending with the manumission of the serfs. What he had stumbled across in Marseille's archives was a new phenomenon. Among other things, it was marked by the emergence of a new word for slave, the Latin sclavus, from which most of the modern words for slave have descended. By 1900, the history had developed to a point where Louise Garrioch was able to comment on the widespread practice of slavery in Roussillon, Guyenne, Provence, and Languedoc, and she herself described slavery as a fait normal in medieval Montpellier. As the Belgian historian Charles Verlinden noted in 1955, slavery in southern France was never practiced on the scale we find elsewhere in the Mediterranean. And just keep your eye on that point, because I will be coming back to it in the final section. Even so, slavery was an uncontested social and juridical fact in the region. This is where things get interesting. Between 1271 and 1659, the French royal domain gradually annexed the Mediterranean counties, tinted in this 16th century map. In the process, France absorbed a society where slavery was a lived reality and a juridical fact, or in some cases, a very recent memory. The blind spots that exist in French historiography are a local instance of a more general phenomenon. European historiography as a whole has not come to terms with the phenomenon of Mediterranean slavery in the later Middle Ages. Julian Schiele and Stefan Hans describe the mindset in this way: how could slavery be part of what is thought to be the cradle of today's Europe? The reluctance to incorporate Mediterranean slavery into larger narratives of nation and rights has interesting consequences. As Ivan Armenteros and Mohamed Ouerfeli recently pointed out, the ideas of liberty and equality articulated during the Enlightenment did not appear in an intellectual vacuum. They were relationally produced. Critiques of slavery began to circulate in 16th century France in the works of Montaigne, La Boétie, Bodin, and others. Although these authors drew their examples from classical antiquity, this is pretty much what humanist rhetoric demanded, they were really thinking about the present day. And it was the Mediterranean, from Ottoman Turkey to Spain, that provided the contrast against which the humanists articulated a philosophy of freedom. This paper offers a framework for understanding the history of slavery in France from the perspective of the Mediterranean borderlands. The slow collision between the Kingdom of France and Roussillon, Languedoc, and Provence offers the dynamic that makes the case worth considering. I want to explore the possibility that France's annexation of slaveholding regions of the Mediterranean helped shape ideas or patterns that came later. Peabody, whose important work challenges the dominant juridical or constitutional narrative, has already traced an important strand of Southern influence by locating the origins of early modern France's free soil principle in the customs of Toulouse. And Sue, if you're out there, thanks so much for the conversations we've had over the last couple of weeks about our common interests. My own contribution is inspired by the belief that ideas do not develop in a social vacuum, and that jurists and parliamentarians are not the only actors in history. Slavery is a relation of domination. Any historical treatment of the subject has to take into account social facts and social actions, including the actions of enslaved people. By the 14th century, thanks to Europe's paper revolution, and I've just given you here a sense of the kinds of documents I work on, the volume of extant archival material in southern France takes off. And this is the kind of material that makes it actually possible to write the history that I was proposing. Yet despite the sources, the study of slavery in Mediterranean France is still rudimentary. The number of articles concerning slavery published in the Annales du Midi can be counted on one hand, and the two most interesting were authored by Charles Verlinden more than 50 years ago. The journal Provence Historique has never published an article on late medieval Mediterranean slavery, to judge at least by their very sophisticated search engine. Now, there are important exceptions outside these two journals, of course. So one of them is this really important work by Philippe Bernardi, published in 1999, the study of Provençal slavery, and recent work by Rebecca Weiner, Elodie Capet, and others on Perpignan. Building on this work, I would like to offer two case studies that explore Southern French slavery from a social historical perspective. The first engages with and extends Peabody's arguments regarding Toulouse. The argument is that the actions of slaves and probably labor recruiters helped transform a body of law concerning unfreed peasants and townsfolk into a body of law that applied to chattel slaves. The second case turns to Provence, which is my world of research, and features a case of slave litigation from early 15th century Marseille, brought by a formerly enslaved Berber woman. The support provided offstage by her neighbors suggests that domestic slavery in Provence was regulated by community norms and social compacts governing the semiotics of prestige. There is no evidence to suggest that the French crown, after the annexation of Provence in 1481, took steps to eliminate domestic slavery. Instead, the practice arose and collapsed in the region for complex reasons located in cultural and gender norms. So let me turn now to my first case. In the brief history of slavery offered in the Six Livres de la République, first published in 1576, Jean Baudin mentioned the case of a Genoese merchant who had come to Toulouse with his slave and was told that every slave who sets foot in the city is free. As suggested by the marginalia you see here, contemporary readers took note. The story told by Baudin, curiously, has never been independently verified in any contemporary record. Like the equally celebrated story of the liberation of a cargo of slaves in Bordeaux in 1571, it may well turn out to be an embroidery. And here I have an extended footnote on these issues, especially concerning the 1571 event. And I'd be really interested in talking with people afterwards if you're interested in this. But if so, it was an embroidery grounded in some truth, namely the fascinating history of liberty in southwestern France. A considerable body of evidence from the later 14th century and onward shows that men and women escaping servitude in Catalonia, in Roussillon, successfully claimed liberty in Toulouse and nearby Pamiers. The evidence consists of archival records from both sides of the Aragonese-French border, as well as historical and jurisprudential accounts published in later centuries. One of the earliest in the series, assembled by Sue Peabody, dates to 1373, and is especially important because we find it in a contemporary archival source from Toulouse. The case, which was originally discovered by Philippe Wolff, involves a Greek slave named Anthony Soldani, who had fled Perpignan and gained liberty in Toulouse. As Wolff's discussion makes clear, this was the first of several known cases where the legal justification for the manumission of a fugitive slave was found in this custom, the one you see here, numbered 155B in Alphonse Tardif's 1884 edition of the Customs of Toulouse. A history of Toulouse published in 1687 provides additional accounts of fugitive slaves gaining freedom in Toulouse in the years 1402 and 1406. And we find a number of others following this. So what this shows, in fact, is that the case cited by Baudin, in other words, was part of what was, in fact, a long-standing practice in the region. Peabody has already laid out the complex timeline of events and has shown how an obscure provision in Toulouse's customs became a universal legal maxim. Here, I would like to extend her argument by developing the context of Mediterranean slavery and the pursuit of liberties in the 12th and 13th centuries. So what I'm going to move in into here is just a very brief potted history of Mediterranean slavery. There's been a lot of rich research in the last couple of decades, so this is a very highly compressed history. In the 11th century, a new system of slavery, distinct from both its ancient and early medieval counterparts, emerged in Mediterranean Europe. The system had its roots in a novel prohibition on the enslavement of co-religionists. As Geoffrey Finn Paul has argued, the prohibition developed first in the Islamic world and was later picked up in Christendom. Both societies, whose commercial horizons were henceforth restricted by the emergence of what Finn Paul calls no slaving zones, responded by developing slaving zones across the Mediterranean and also into sub-Saharan Africa, Greece, and the greater Black Sea region. The Aragonese conquest of Majorca and Valencia in the second quarter of the 13th century led to a new influx of slaves of Iberian Muslim origin. Within a few decades, Venice and Genoa joined the growing commerce. And by the 1290s or early 1300s, a considerable number of slaves from the Black Sea region were entering the Italian market for re-export across the Mediterranean to Spain and especially the Mamluk states. At its height around 1400, this traffic was bringing in at least 4,000 slaves per year through Venice and Genoa alone. And the heat map I've put here, I call it a conjectural heat map because there really isn't data per se for most of these points. We have some data for cities like Barcelona, Genoa, Florence, Majorca, all throughout North Africa and the Mamluk states. We just don't have the social historical records that allow us to actually give data for this. The thing I really want you to focus on here is the fact that there are some real hot spots in the map where densities of slaves are reaching 15-20% of the population in Aragon, in some of the Mediterranean islands, and in some of the Italian cities, again, notably Genoa and Florence. Now, in the 12th and 13th centuries, the growing presence and visibility of Mediterranean slavery was generating talk of freedom elsewhere in Europe. And one historian who's surveyed a lot of the literature inspired by this has described it as a wind of liberty, a vent de liberté. But in French royal domains, at least, the talk of liberty was not directed toward the rising tide of chattel slaves down south. Instead, it targeted the arbitrary and unjust servitudes imposed by seigneurs on serfs, peasants, and townsfolk. The enfranchisements and manumissions that flourished in this atmosphere were diverse, and we really don't need to go into the details here, because the only important thing I just want you to bear in mind from this is that the city of Toulouse also got into the act, declaring here in this custom that people arriving in the city should be free from any servile payments owed to their lords. So this is part of a huge body of literature. We have lots of charters and similar documents from the 12th and 13th centuries that are very similar to this. Why all this talk of liberty? First, servitudes formed part of a political economy that enriched lords and castellans. The act of releasing individuals and corporations from servile payments, therefore, probably helped undermine seigneurial power. Second, freedom was not free. Individuals and corporations had to pay to be released from their servitudes. For late Capetian and early Valois kings, as Elizabeth A.R. Brown has noted, selling freedom from servitude was a tried and true technique for raising money. And Peggy, if you're out there, thanks so much for our conversations over the last couple of months on this really fascinating subject. Although Toulouse's custom did not say so in so many words, new citizens released from servile payments to their lords were henceforth responsible for paying city taxes. Finally, the texts of royal franchises often speak of the good the act will do to the king's soul. So what's clear from this is that enfranchisement was also considered a pious act. So here's the basic point. Texts like this were common, yet none of them, as I mentioned, aimed to liberate the rising tide of chattel slaves in the Mediterranean. As the historian Mireille Mounier has explained, acts of franchise and manumission had nothing to do with juridical freedom. Instead, they released peasants and townsfolk from arbitrary seigneurial exactions. What we're dealing with, it's best to think about it as a new tax policy that's just being dressed up in the stirring language of liberty. So here's the puzzle. In the 13th century, a law concerning tax policy entered Toulouse's customs. A century later, in 1373, the custom was cited for the first time as the legal basis for granting liberty to a slave. And historians have in fact noticed this peculiar transformation in the law's target. As André Viala, the historian of the Parliament of Toulouse, put it, the privilege was originally designed to protect serfs, but later on, this context was more or less forgotten. Philippe Wolff describes how the Capitoul of Toulouse, in freeing the slave in 1373, relied on a text, the custom, that in actual fact concerned serfs. Its application, he remarks here, was gradually extended to the category of slaves legally unknown in Toulouse. So what happened in the intervening century? To understand this, we need to consider the actions of enslaved people. And this is where I want to bring the enslaved people back into the histories that we've been developing. Slavery, unsurprisingly, inspires those who seek to escape it. Fugitive slaves were a legislative concern in Aragon from the 13th century. By the 14th, the scale of the phenomenon led to the development of insurance policies against fugitive slaves. Now, in the 13th century, the area around Toulouse was not yet a destination. And here's the reason. The majority of Aragonese slaves at the time were Iberian Muslims. In pursuit of freedom, most would have fled west or south toward the Mudahar communities in Aragon and Castile, and even Muslim states in Granada and the Maghreb. By 1373, however, so you think back to the history I provided earlier, the demographic situation had changed as Greeks, Tatars, Russians, and Circassians flooded the market thanks to the growing involvement of Genoese and Venetian slavers. None of the new slaves had cultural or linguistic connections with Andalusian or Maghrebi Muslims. So this is why from 1373 onward, we find fugitives turning toward Toulouse and Pamiers. At the outset, as I noted, Toulouse's customs did not apply to slaves. Curiously, however, the custom carried a latent potential to do so. And this argument is a little complex, but let me try to explain it this way. Over hundreds of years of lexical drift, the Roman word for liberty progressively departed from the juridical concept to which it had once pointed. Conversely, or kind of at the same time, the Roman word servus came to mean serf in many contexts. By the 12th and 13th centuries, liberty and servitude in places like Toulouse had come to be associated with freedom from the payment of unjust exactions. But in juridical contexts, and this is thanks, at least in part, to the resurgence of Roman law, liberty retained its older connotation as the antithesis of slavery. For this reason, any lawyer could argue quite legitimately that Toulouse's custom gave liberty to anyone identified as a servus. Now, this capacity to free chattel slaves, it just lay dormant until it was activated by the arrival of the slaves themselves. So here we have a real mystery. How did the slaves of Valencia, Barcelona, and Perpignan learn about this loophole afforded by the language of the customs of Toulouse and Pamiers? We know from a variety of Aragonese sources that although many slaves performed unskilled labor, others worked as artisans, master builders, apothecaries' assistants, and even commercial agents. So they worked in the kinds of occupations that allowed for a certain degree of mobility, in other words, and put them in touch with networks of rumor. Freed slaves may well have had the opportunity to travel to Languedoc and bring back reports. intermediaries and brokers were almost certainly involved in spreading the word. And we've known about this from Aragonese scholarship for at least a century. After the Black Death, as labor costs went up, labor recruitment became a priority. It is easy to imagine brokers based in Western Languedoc luring slaves from Aragon with offers of assistance, labor contracts, and promises of freedom. This history, the one I've been sketching out here, is yet to be seriously researched and written. But if the scenario I've offered here is accurate, it gives some context for understanding the otherwise curious rise of the free soil principle. A custom originally aimed at clarifying tax policy was repurposed a century later as a law able to free chattel slaves. Lawyers and jurists were involved in this process, but the transformation depended upon the actions of ordinary folk. Fugitive slaves and the brokers who assisted them had a hand in the unmaking of chattel slavery in southwestern France, and their actions contributed to the rise of a free soil principle that subsequently spread across early modern France. For my second case, let me turn to southeastern France. One of the really striking features of this region, at least where slavery is concerned, is the absence of a hard border separating Angevin Provence from French Dauphiné. In the 14th and 15th centuries, we find slaves in the cities and towns of Provence as far north as Avignon, yet evidence for slaves vanishes just north of Avignon. Over in southwestern France, in the previous case, the existence of a political border between France and Aragon helped push the development of a free soil doctrine in Toulouse. In the southeast, by contrast, the practice of slaveholding simply petered out with distance from the coast. Adding to the puzzle is the curious fact that Provence was never more than lightly touched by slavery. By the 14th century, as I mentioned earlier with those notarial documents, we do find some evidence concerning slaves in notarial registers and other sources. In this particular map, I've put together from the research of Philippe Bernardi, to which I've added some remarks by Jacques Hers. And what this is showing is evidence for slaves and slave ownership in certain cities and major towns across Provence. Most of the slaves that we're finding in the sources derived from Greece and the Black Sea region. And the majority were women whose masters demanded domestic and sexual services. And on the latter, there's some really interesting evidence that you find from time to time in manumission contracts that describe or mention the children of slaves by their masters. Yet the proportion of slaves in Provence was low compared to Aragon, Majorca, Sicily, and cities such as Genoa and Florence. After 1400, little evidence suggests that Provence participated in the growing turn to sub-Saharan slaves. With the exception of royal and aristocratic courts, slavery appears to have waned in Provence before the annexation of the county by France in 1481. Now, some of you, I'm sure, are thinking about the galley slave phenomenon that begins in the 16th century. But this, in point of fact, is a new phenomenon that was inspired by the changing patterns and practices of warfare in the Mediterranean. And the crucial phenomenon where Provence is concerned is that the practice was pushed by the French crown and did not emerge indigenously from Provence itself. Where slavery is concerned, in short, Greater Provence was barren soil. If I had to guess, I would have said that the same was true in Dauphiné and points north, and that this explains why slavery gradually petered out with distance from the coast. It is not easy to know how to explain the phenomenon. There was no discernible jurisprudential, moral, or ideological opposition to slavery. In the time that remains, I would like to sketch out an argument that situates the barren soil phenomenon in culture and gender. The argument follows the Pattersonian principle of parasitic dishonoring, according to which, these are Patterson's words, a major gain to the master was the enhancement of his honor in the debasement of the slave. Slaveholding, on this argument, formed part of the semiotics of prestige. That being the case, communities concerned with controlling access to social prestige had a vested interest in regulating the acquisition and treatment of slaves. The barren soil phenomenon in Provence, in particular, arose because the region's gender norms granted women considerably more access to private wealth and public life than we find, say, in Liguria or Tuscany. The use and abuse of female domestic slaves for the purposes of social enhancement, on this argument, ran contrary to the region's cultural systems for pursuing honor and prestige. Now, you'll probably be relieved to hear that I don't plan to lay out all the elements of this claim in this paper. And part of the reason is that with important exceptions, and this includes the work of André Courtemanche and Susan McDonough, the history of women and gender in medieval Provence is still a work in progress. In other words, we just don't have the literature yet to develop the crucial gender side of the argument that I'm hoping to develop here. So here what I'll limit myself to, in effect, is to evidence for the existence of what I've been calling the barren soil phenomenon. And to do that, let me turn to the case of the Berber slave I mentioned at the outset. Given the near total absence of ego documents from later medieval Provence, we rarely have access to contemporary attitudes towards slavery. The major exception to this can be found in court cases such as this one. You can see the title page of the case here, where the arguments and depositions provide insights into social facts and states of mind. So what I'll do now is just give you some of the necessary background for understanding the case as a whole. The trial transcripts, combined with archival evidence that I began collecting last year with my doctoral student, Ryan Lowe, make it possible to sketch the life histories of both of the principal actors. The story begins late in the year 1387 when Père Huguet, who was a shipwright and a privateer, and in the 1390s at least, a fairly prominent citizen of Marseille, acquired a Berber woman named Magdalena as war booty. Now, in point of fact, I'll keep calling her Magdalena, but that would not have been her name as a child. Like virtually all the slaves that were acquired in this way, she would have been baptized, perhaps forcibly baptized, and assigned a Christian name at that particular moment. Magdalena was one of the 5 or 6 most common names given to women slaves. The history of the two then runs up to 1413, when we find Père drowning in financial insolvency. A crucial event took place in 1399, when Père paid the dowry that allowed Magdalena to marry one of his clients, a shipwright, an immigrant from Flanders, who in fact died soon afterwards. Now, importantly, Père did not manumit Magdalena at the time of her marriage. And I realize this seems really strange, but in point of fact, it was perfectly consonant with canon law. It was perfectly fine for a free Christian to marry an enslaved person. After her first marriage, Magdalena, her juridical status really unclear and ambiguous, took up the trade of pawnbroker. Now, the first plea in the series of cases that I have was lodged in court in August of 1406, when a shoemaker named Hugo of Chorges appeared before the judge of one of Marseille's courts. According to his plea, Père was in debt to Hugo's wife, Magdalena, Colina, in the amount of 6 florins. And what has happened, obviously, in the interval is, following the death of her first husband, Magdalena clearly remarried. A few days later, an indignant Père appeared in court to contest the claim. Far from having any valid grounds for action against him, he argued, Magdalena was in fact his slave, or at least had never been manumitted by him. His frustration with the turn of events is palpable in subsequent statements, where he described her lies and ingratitude and characterized Hugo as Magdalena's alleged husband. A few days later, he lodged a formal counterclaim. Among other things, he alleged that she had stolen 30 florins from him to set herself up as a moneylender. A year later, after many ins and outs, the judge delivered his ruling. And what he declared is that both parties had in fact failed to prove their original claims. So in a sense, both parties had lost. Magdalena, however, had shown that Pair failed to honor a legacy that had been made to her by Pair's recently deceased wife. So he was in fact forced to pay that over to her. A stunned and embittered Pair immediately lodged an appeal, and here's the first folio of that case, which failed. But Pair was nothing if not dogged, and in January of 1408, he launched a second lawsuit against Magdalena, arguing that she had violated a provision of the Corpus Juris Civilis prohibiting a freed slave from suing her former master. Now, although Magdalena's legal representative complained about the oddity of the situation, in our language, this was like double jeopardy, the judge allowed that case, the second case, to move forward. Now, that case also failed. Still undeterred, Pair lodged yet another appeal, which temporarily succeeded. And it was only thanks to a direct plea made by Magdalena to Louis II of Anjou at his court in Aix-en-Provence that Pair's lawsuit was finally stilled. The dispute between Magdalena and Pair, encompassing a half dozen pleas and appeals over a period of 2 years, is one of the longest continuously running disputes in Marseille's extant court records. It is also one of the longest in terms of page count. The surviving elements alone amount to over 300 pages. Clearly, a lot was at stake. On Pair's side, his honor and reputation. On Magdalena's side, her freedom. So from this material, I'm just going to pull out just one example illustrating the argument that I'm hoping to develop about the barren soil principle. This is this really compelling moment that takes place during the witness testimony phase of the first trial. Now, although Pair had made a number of claims in the case, a number of arguments, his case hinged on the first one, shown here, to the effect that Magdalena had been his slave for many years, that he had openly possessed her as a slave, and that this was common knowledge among people in the know. In a world located in the borderlands of slavery, where slavery was relatively uncommon, how was anyone able to know who was a slave? Before the rise of racialized sub-Saharan slavery, most slaves in the Mediterranean did not constitute a marked and visible class. By their clothing and appearance, female domestic slaves would probably have been indistinguishable from free servants. In the absence of visible clues, awareness of a slave's status could be maintained only through continual inferences drawn from behavioral cues, such as accent. Absent these cues, awareness of slave status was bound to decay. And problematically, Père Huguet had no proof of sale or another written instrument demonstrating his ownership because of the manner in which he had acquired her. To try and demonstrate Magdalena's status, therefore, he relied on the memories of his neighbors and other people in his circle. Let me show you what they said in response to his argument. And I'm just going to give you a moment to read this yourself. Now, as you run through them, remember, these were the witnesses called by Père. With one exception, this group had, in effect, voted for Magdalena's freedom. The status of slave in Provence depended in part on the assent of the community, and if that assent was withdrawn, the status could disappear. At the time of the first trial in 1406, Père was already falling deeply into debt. 5 years after the conclusion of the dispute, he was a broken man. The fact that his slave had manumitted herself without his permission, in other words, was only part of his problem. What seems likely is that the decision by witnesses to veto his case was part of a broader set of sanctions imposed on him for his failure to manumit Magdalena once she had entered society and had become a productive and valued member of the community. In case you're wondering, the evidence from the second trial indicates that Magdalena despised Per, and I think it was, in fact, very likely that he had abused her and that neighbors knew what was going on and sought to rescue her from the situation. There's some really interesting evidence in the case and the testimony that her supporters included two prominent businesswomen and moneylenders, and even Per's own wives. So let me draw these remarks to a close. The understanding that there were no slaves in France, common from the late 16th century onward, put France's Mediterranean regions in the historiographical blind spot observed by Marc Bloch in 1929. The continuing existence of this blind spot has made it difficult to assemble a reasonably coherent picture of what was going on in Languedoc, Roussillon, and Provence in the 14th and 15th centuries. As the fragments assembled here suggest, the situation has a complexity that defies any simple narrative. In the later Middle Ages, a new form of slavery developed throughout the Mediterranean basin, including the region that became southern France. Mediterranean slavery informed the abolitionist ideas that began to emerge in 16th century French humanist tracts. With the French annexation of Languedoc, Provence, and Roussillon, the historical memory and to some degree the practice of slavery was also absorbed into France, however brief the moment. At the outset of this process, there was no French jurisprudential opposition. When an abolitionist jurisprudence emerged in Toulouse, following a history laid out by Peabody, it did so because a custom originally intended to release new citizens from fiscal servitudes was transformed into a jurisprudence of freedom. The actions of fugitive slaves and brokers were essential to this act of legal repurposing. The free soil doctrine that eventually emerged arose from contingent circumstances and depended, at least in part, on the actions of fugitive slaves. These often nameless slaves and the unintended consequences of their actions deserve a place in our histories of abolitionism in France. That is the lesson suggested by the first case. The second case is different. There were slaves in southeastern France, but few compared to what we find elsewhere in the Western Mediterranean basin. A host of factors may be marshaled to explain this variation, and I haven't gone over some of the other ones here, but among them was an unspoken discomfort with the way in which women chattel slaves were used as devices for signaling men's prestige. Now, this didn't bother the Genoese or the Florentines, to name the two most salient comparans. If the actors largely offstage in the drama of Magdalena's suit for freedom are any guide, however, it did bother the Provençaux. The ownership of slaves, subjected to a kind of passive community regulation, never really took off in the region. Now, it remains to be seen whether this discomfort existed elsewhere, such as Montpellier, where slaves seem to have been even rarer than in Marseille. And the important question here is how much can we generalize from this barren soil principle that I'm claiming existed in Provence. For me, the lesson is that the opposition to slavery arises not only from philosophers and jurists, but also from the habitus of culture and gender. Together, these two cases, from Languedoc and Provence, suggest that southern France, as a land of slavery in the later Middle Ages, has much to teach us about the rise of abolitionist thought and practice in early modern France.